Welcome back to our Won't You Be Our Neighbor series. We're very excited today to be in conversation with our friend and neighbor, Brian, who will tell us a little more about himself in just a few minutes. But before we get there, I just want to say a word about our series. Our hope is to continue to deepen our conversations and our relationships with community members on the Northwest side of the city of Chicago as we at Friendship Presbyterian Church and Friendship Community Place prepare to move into the ground floor of 5150 Northwest Highway, where we hope to create opportunities for the community to connect, to grow, to organize, and to continue to learn more about one another. We're talking to neighbors that share some of our same hopes around creating as inclusive and caring and compassionate a neighborhood as we can that welcomes people from afar and from right in our own backyards into the space at 5150. And so today with us, we have Brian, and I'm going to invite you to tell us, Brian, who you are, and in the spirit of Mr. Rogers, what makes you uniquely you? How did you come to be part of the Northwest side of Chicago, and what are some of the things that you are up to?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Shauna. I really appreciate it. And I'm really excited about all the things that are to come at 5150. So happy to be part of this conversation and looking ahead to the future. But yeah, a little bit about me. My name is Brian. I use he, him, his pronouns. I am a queer Northwest Sider. I've lived in Chicago for about 20 years, and about 4 years ago, my husband and I were looking to get a little bit bigger space to live in, and so we looked further northwest than we were living at the time, which was in Avondale. So we found this great home in a neighborhood that I had a lot of reservations about. And yet the home spoke to us. And so we took the risk and severed geographic ties with our old neighborhood, which was full of our friends and people who really visibly shared our values, to a space that historically has not been so progressive, has not been so embracing of all of the different dimensions of diversity. And so for the first few years of living in the Northwest Side, we kind of kept to ourselves. I think it was out of fear for our own safety, in some ways, as two visibly queer people. It was a little bit out of fear of what beliefs maybe in our community that would make us uncomfortable or would be actively working against the vision of Chicago and of the world that we hold very dearly. And truthfully, it wasn't until about 16 months ago that I really started my active work in investing in the geographic community of Portage Park, Jefferson Park, the 45th Ward overall, and really finding solace through the most difficult times of the COVID-19 pandemic in the relationships that I was actively building throughout the Northwest Side. So it took a pandemic to make me step out of my comfort zone, which was the four walls of my home, and to start discovering that people across our neighborhood are not the people that I thought they were, but actually are people who share an anti-racist practice, who want to see a world that embraces differences and celebrates differences, and works to reconcile with the difficult history and present state of injustice and oppression. And so I've done that in a bunch of different spaces. I'll name a few. First, I responded to a call in March of 2020 that many folks did across the city of Chicago to start some sort of mutual aid effort in the neighborhood that we live in. And so just to explain kind of the idea of mutual aid is about supporting in sort of a reciprocal manner people. It's about creating a horizontal framework for ensuring survival and thriving of people in a particular community. Typically, when we think about supporting each other in sort of a structured way, it has sort of like a hierarchical component. There's sort of like the giver over here, and then there's the receiver over here. And there's a lot of baggage that goes in hand with both of those different roles. And so with mutual aid, we're trying to say that everyone has something to give and everyone needs support at certain times. And so what we're here to do really is to work together to create relationships that then uncover where we can support one another, versus having more of a hierarchical and like power dynamic driven charity model. So solidarity, not charity, is sort of like the catchphrase of the mutual aid network. And that's what we've tried to establish as the foundation of Portage Park Mutual Aid, which I am one of many members of. It's a fiercely non-hierarchical group. We don't have a leader. We don't have a board. We just have ourselves and each other and the relationships that we've fought to build over the last 14 months. And the outcomes of those relationships have looked like friendships, have looked like food support, have looked like rent and utility support, and so much more.
Yeah.
And so that's been one key part of how I've joined with my neighbors to support each other and get to know each other in this difficult time.
Great, thank you. And I want to dig even a little bit deeper into some more details about mutual aid, because I would like for folks to really understand not only some of the principles of mutuality, but also what are some of the key components, particularly in these last 16 months, that have been really needed and necessary in terms of building some solidarity. But before I do that, I just want to come back to what you said at the very beginning around what happens sometimes when we in the city of Chicago are going along to and trying to get along and are maybe kind of enclosed community, right? I hear in your story this sense of I knew I fit, or I knew that there was a place for me in one neighborhood of the city, and then I moved and it wasn't clear. And I think oftentimes it's moments of crisis in which it becomes so clear to us that we need each other. And that's one of the things that I heard in your story is coming into this season of a pandemic that we couldn't have predicted, and we haven't even still understood fully, I think, the prolonged impact of, but it's made us all very aware of how much we need one another. And I hear that as an essential acknowledgement in mutual aid. And just want to pause to really take in, what does it mean to come to terms with the reality that we can't do this alone, and that we need our neighbors, and we need to cultivate relationships with one another. And so I wonder if you would just say a little bit about how that maybe changed you, or changed the way that you think about your own story and your own identity.
Sure. Yeah, that's a lot to unpack, but well, I will say, I've sort of in my my career, my paid work, I've worked in the nonprofit industry for the last 12 years, doing marketing and communications leadership. And I'd say in the nonprofit space, there are certain understandings that you have of how the world works and how the world is reliant on nonprofits as organizations. And so I think, there was an unpacking of my investment in nonprofits that happened over 15 months, where I really started to uncover some ways that nonprofits aren't maybe helping people in the way that they intend to, and could really use some reckoning and some revisions themselves. I'd also say that I am a fairly introverted person, and so something that I discovered about myself over the last 15 months, and it really, once I made that self-discovery, I realized that I was more of this than I was giving myself credit for, was that I really enjoy organizing. I really enjoy building relationships with people, but those relationships need to be meaningful. I'm not so good at building kind of surface level relationships. I need to be in a space where I'm hearing from someone about their life, about what they're experiencing, what they're feeling, what they're going through. And I need to be able to offer, my hopes, fears, joys in the same way. And I think that was a really big turning point for me. It was realizing how reliant I am on my relationships with others. I think also I learned that sometimes my fears can get in the way of experiencing joy, and my fears about the neighborhood of Portage Park, the Northwest Side in general, that this was sort of like a suburban enclave of Chicago that preferred to stay away from Chicago. It needed to be called Chicago for the professional purposes of people who lived here, but it didn't want to really associate with the city in other ways. And that fear kept me from building the relationships that I eventually came to access in this neighborhood. People I never would have met, people of different generations and lived experiences and races, ethnicities. And yeah, like I just, that was a really unexpected gift in the face of such a deeply difficult year.
Yeah. Thank you for that. It reminds me in some of our other conversations, it's come up again and again of how, because our city is divided in the way that it is by neighborhood, and we know that there's a lot of complexity there, and there's some real cultural and ethnic beauty to some of the characteristics and stories and histories of some of our Chicago neighborhoods. But we also know that we've been systematically divided and conquered as a community as a way of controlling resources, right? That there's systemic inequities in the division and the segregation of our city that continue to get perpetuated. And I think sometimes what happens is that we begin to speak of whole neighborhoods as if they're monolithic, right? And then we even believe those own stories about ourselves. And one of the things that has been so heartwarming to me in these conversations is again and again, as we've reached out and as we've organized and as we've started caring for one another, what we've found is we have found our people, right? We find each other, and we realize that there's a lot of folks who shared the similar desires of building a more equitable and just and more connected community across our city, which I think brings us back to mutual aid, and that it really is such a beautiful and has a history. And I don't know if you would be willing to say a little bit about sort of mutual aid wasn't invented during COVID-19, right? Like it has a long history in our communities and in our cities, and often has grown up in communities where there's been an extraction, right, of resources, and that for survival, as you said, it's become a necessity. But if you could say a little bit about how mutual aids are formed, and then how is the Portage Park one functioning? What are some key areas? We've been asking the question of where does it hurt? Where are some places we're seeing that we really are needing to come together in solidarity with one another?
So my understanding of mutual aid is that it really got its founding in labor movements in the 1800s, where workers were being exploited, and so they needed to come together to provide resources for one another. And in the early days, that started off as like building homes for one another, but then eventually it evolved into a form of what we might currently think of as unions, where there is like a robust network of support around medical care, retirement, and whatnot that workers can rely on when their employers were unwilling to lean into their responsibility as employers. And so that's sort of where I understand mutual aid, the concept of mutual aid growing from, and certainly it has evolved, just like you said, Shauna, particularly in communities that have been forcibly removed from those systems of care. They've had to like build systems that worked for them to allow communities to thrive. And so, there are many examples of mutual aid networks, particularly in communities of color. I think that in Louisiana, for instance, there's a very long history of Black women-led mutual aid networks. And even in our city of Chicago, one of my favorite organizations, Brave Space Alliance, is one of the leaders in how modern day mutual aid looks, because it is a network built by and for queer and trans, Black and Latinx people in Chicago. So so yes, your point is very true. Mutual aid was not born on March 14th, 2020, but it was definitely revitalized and revisited by communities across the country as a way of recognizing the potential and ultimately seeing impact economically, emotionally, and otherwise of COVID-19 on communities. So just like to zoom in a little bit on Portage Park Mutual Aid. We have continued to support each other in many of the same ways that we were on day one of the pandemic. Today, our support looks a little different than it did early on. we're a kind of a big volunteer group of maybe 60 people with about 20 people who are pretty active in our community to make strategic decisions about how we want to support the neighborhood, come together when we have needs around food rescue, and also raise money for folks who are experiencing adverse economic situations, like a sudden influx in utility payments that can no longer be covered by any institutional program. We have had issues between landlords and renters that we've had to support and intervene with. So yeah, at a certain point in the pandemic, we were delivering food boxes to about 30 families per week in the neighborhood. Today, that looks like about 15 boxes every 2 weeks to families. And so, yeah, what we've seen is that like the pandemic might be lessening in its impact to some extent, but many of the economic situations that people were experiencing before March of 2020 are continuing and will continue because we live in such a deeply imbalanced and classist society. So yeah, I would say we're looking to the future. We're looking to, where we go from here as a movement in Portage Park Mutual Aid. How can we support other mutual aid networks in our area, like Jefferson Park? How can we ally with some of our mutual aid compatriots on the Northwest side? How can we sustain regular connections to food? How can we continue to rescue food? How can we continue to bring a sense of wholeness to our community members, our friends, our family members, our neighbors?
Yeah, thank you. Can you say a little bit more about when you say rescue food? I'm not sure folks will know what that means.
Oh yeah, definitely. So what folks may or may not know is the US, but really globally, has a really big problem with food waste. We waste a significant amount of food, both at the individual home level, to the grocery store level, to the processing level, to the farming level. So much food that could be going to tables is being lost due to inefficiencies, due to personal, consumer choices and whatnot. And that food is still edible. It's still out there. It still can be consumed by people. And so food rescue means that we are going to grocery stores, restaurants, and other places that have food that's potentially going to be hitting the dumpster. And we're saying, no, this food is still good. It's very nutritious, delicious, and we want to divert it from the waste bin and into the kitchens of families who otherwise are not able to access food. So it's an interesting and emerging area of supporting other people and kind of curbing the long and disastrous history of food waste. And so, yeah, we get notifications from businesses that they have, some food that they'd like to donate. And so then we're activating this like huge volunteer network across the Northwest side to like pick up that food, take it to a central space, process it, and then get it ready for the weekend's deliveries. And this is something, again, that's entirely volunteer run, that happens on an ongoing basis, and is, it's something that people are investing time and love and talent and resources into because they believe that we all deserve the opportunity to have food and be well and whole.
I love the intersection of that at a work towards food justice and environmental justice and concern, right? That those things actually are very much intertwined. And I think one of the values of some of our mutual aid networks is we're able to work at some of those intersecting issues. And I also hear in your story the necessity of collaborating with both individuals and organizations. So we were saying earlier that there are ways in which the traditional not-for-profits haven't been able to have the impact that they intend, or we continue sometimes to have a very top-down or one-sided approach to care of one another in our communities, and that mutual aid offers another way to think about it, another model for engaging. But it doesn't mean that there isn't a role, right, for community organizations, community businesses to play. And I'm thinking about how at Friendship, we're launching a not-for-profit, right? It's called Friendship Community Place, and it's how we hope to create an avenue of engagement. And I'd love to think about how can organizations come alongside. You've just named in the food rescue piece some really essential places, right? These organizations and institutions have the capacity to either waste or really make a huge contribution, right, to the issues of food access and food justice. And are there other ways you're seeing through Portage Park Mutual Aid, not only individuals, but organizations get involved, and how maybe that is even changing how we think about ourselves as organizations?
That's a good question. I can't speak to too many like partnerships that Portage Park Mutual Aid has forged with some of our nonprofit partners in the community. Yeah, in some ways, mutual aid really is presenting a critique of some of those organizations and some of those approaches. But I would say that one of our co-collaborators, Andrew, is a really strong leader in a weekly food pantry that has distribution in our neighborhood. And so there have been opportunities where one week our food program just can't sustain our 30 plus neighbors in Portage Park that week. And so Andrew's able to connect with this organization and say, this week we need a little bit more support. Can we bring some folks into the food pantry so that we can continue to make sure they have food access? So that's one example. Truthfully, I think it speaks to the Northwest side that there is kind of a deficit of community organizations in our part of the world. We did a little bit of an asset map early on in the pandemic because we didn't want to, replicate work that was already being done. And we found that with a few exceptions, there were just not a lot of those human services focused organizations in this part of Chicago compared with other parts of the city. And certainly, the question of why that is has multiple answers, and I could hypothesize all day about it. But yeah, it's certainly, I think it speaks in some way to perhaps a certain stubborn resilience of the character of this neighborhood. I think it also speaks to the rich undergirding of faith communities in the area, that they may be the dominant support structures for neighbors on the Northwest side. Yeah, and yet, thinking back to one of many losses in 2020 is an organization in the sort of Old Irving Park area that was doing a lot of outreach for people experiencing homelessness. And so, it's a complicated area. It's a complicated topic. And I know that there are a lot of uncomfortable but important conversations happening across the neighborhood and across the Northwest side on how do we support each other best? How do we set aside our own instinct to provide charity and rather build relationships with folks that we would otherwise not have built relationships with due to visible or other perceived differences?
Yeah, I think that's such an important invitation. And again, why I come back, I think, to mutual aid again and again as a model, because one of the things that we also have been asking ourselves and our neighbors is we do want to know where it hurts and where the needs are, but we don't want to continue to perpetuate this idea that there's this binary, here are the needy and here are the helpers, but to understand that we all are in need and we all are hurting in some ways, and we all have the capacity to contribute and to give and to be human resources, right, to one another in a really beautiful way, which leads us to also asking the question that you asked. Well, what are the assets present? What are the things that are already happening that we can build on, even if we have to look really hard to find them, even if there are only a few? And so I'm wondering, as you've done this work, what are some of the things, and maybe it's not sometimes we talk about like hard and soft skills. Like maybe it's not about like where all the money is, right? Or where all of the obvious like organizing resources are, but what are you finding in terms of uh, what folks are bringing in terms of just human contributions, like ways that folks are showing up for one another, that's giving you hope and that's giving you a sense of, oh, I can see this happening. I see people taking care of each other.
Oh yeah, so many different ways. I mean, it's truly like one day I hope that we'll be able to come together as Portage Park Mutual Aid and just like document the stories, the experiences that we had. Certainly, something as simple as like replying to a Facebook post in our Facebook group if someone's looking for a pair of boots for a new job, and connecting someone with a pair of boots that's their size. From that to designing a flyer advertising where we have a drop-off point for resources for neighbors, to someone who's really good at relationship building and seeing like, oh, this organization over here is doing this important work. I wonder if we can support them and create some sort of like a joint collaboration, which we've done a couple of times with Drive 45, which is another kind of organization that emerged in the times of the pandemic to create a more anti-racist neighborhood in 45th Ward. Yeah, it really, there is no limit to the ways that folks can contribute to something like a mutual aid effort. We needed artwork to excite and like tell the story of Portage Park Mutual Aid. So one of our awesome neighbors, who is a working artist, whose work has been impacted and livelihood has been impacted by the pandemic with all of the closings of the galleries, like she created a beautiful work of art for our Facebook group. It really is, as many ways as it hurts, it also thrives. And there are as many ways to get involved, to reach out to one another, and to, just pitch in. So.
I love that. And I think the thing that's so important that I'm hearing is that it can be such small things, but that collectively create community and create resources. Not everyone at Friendship is even aware of this, but because we went online and we don't have a physical space right now, our church copier is in my home office right over there. And it's like the Cadillac of copiers, because we used to run full print, fancy, creative bulletins for worship every week. And so it was just, it's literally sitting here, right? I engaged and got involved a bit in the Rogers Park Mutual Aid group. And one of the very simple basic needs was labels for the kinds of grocery, packages that were being delivered or picked up regularly. And so there were a number of months at the height of the pandemic that we were printing labels and dropping them off 2 or 3 times a week for grocery delivery. And it was such a small, like very tiny thread in a much larger braid, right? Of folks who were rescuing food, and folks who were signing up to be deliverers, and folks who were volunteering to take calls and to get a sense of where the need was each week. And that it was just one simple way. We had a tool that was being underutilized that we could contribute, right? That we are just, paying for it to exist in the world. Let's actually use it as a contributing tool. And I think that sometimes we are faced with how deep and how wide some of our issues of inequity or our issues around access to resources are, that we can be overwhelmed, and particularly as individuals. And I think the stories of mutual aid and mutual care that are coming out of this season are so important, because I think they teach us that we can participate in ways large and small, right? And that they really do have impact on one another.
Completely. And I would just add, like, it is also critically important to recognize when we can't participate too. Like there is some days it feels overwhelming to think of the endless amount of injustice and need and insurmountable obstacles that are created within our capitalist society. And like that can be really overwhelming. And so it's also important to recognize when we need to take a break and when we need to do what restores us and puts water back into our own pitcher so that we're able to pour water into others.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's such an important reminder, and that it doesn't mean that we're not, it's actually not a lack of participation, it's a matter of sustainability, right? That sometimes we need to rest so that we can continue to be part of a larger collective. I think it's this, it's important to make the distinction between mutuality doesn't mean transactional, right? Like mutuality means that we all have different needs and all have different things to give in different seasons, and that it is a long haul journey, right? That it's not like I'm going to contribute, labels today, and so I'm going to get, food tomorrow, but like I'm going to make a contribution based on what I have, and I'm going to trust that the collective is going to come alongside me when I am in need. And I think that that shouldn't feel as counter to the status quo as it is, but it really is, right? Like we really have been, as you said, I think shaped by society to think that we're on our own and that we have to make our own way, and that really isn't even honest. We are never making our own way. We're always depending on others around us. And I think this season has made that incredibly visible to us. So thank you, Brian, for coming and sharing about mutual aid and Portage Park. And I know there are a lot of other ways that you're engaging and bringing both change and also support in our communities, not by yourself, but in collaboration with others. And I'm so glad to be a collaborator and to continue to think about how we can support one another across our Northwest Side neighborhoods, from Portage Park to Jefferson Park to Norwood Park and beyond. And just really grateful to hear your story and have you with us today.
Well, and thank you so much for creating the space. And, I, as a marketer and communicator, like storytelling is such an important way to understand, huge concepts and understand how individuals become part of a greater network of human beings. And so thanks for letting me share my story today and for all the work that you and the Friendship team are doing.
Awesome. Thank you.